Many people believe that fantasy is just an escape, that creating imaginary worlds is a refuge for those who can't bear reality. But what if I told you that sometimes fantasy is the only place where someone can rebuild themselves? That inventing universes, characters, and stories can actually be a profound form of therapy, even more effective than any medicine? If you've ever felt lost, without control over your own body or destiny, perhaps this story will touch something very intimate within you. And that's why I ask you to stay until the end, because what happened to her could happen to any of us. Her name was Elisa. Or at least, that's what I'll call her here. When she first came to me, she had a distant look in her eyes, the kind that avoids direct contact, as if words were safer than gazes. She was a former athlete, and in every gesture there was still the rigidity of someone who spent years obeying their body, shaping it through sheer discipline. But now, that same body had become a cruel reminder of what she had lost. A car accident, quick, brutal, without warning, had left irreversible damage in her legs. The physical pain was just the surface. What consumed her was the void, the silence that comes when everything that defined who you were simply disappears. During the first few sessions, Elisa spoke very little. Sometimes, the silence would last for long minutes, and I could sense there was something in her that didn't want to be touched, something that resisted even hope. And then, in one of those almost awkward pauses, she uttered a sentence that completely changed the course of her therapy. Slight pause. I started drawing again. She said it like someone confessing a secret, a forbidden habit. I asked her what she drew, and she replied, with a slight tremor in her voice, "A world that only exists when I close my eyes." From that point on, the sessions took on a new dimension. Elisa began to tell me about this world, a place that wasn't exactly real, but wasn't a dream either. A space between what she felt and what she wished to feel. She called it, slight pause, tone of wonder, the Valley of Glass. She said everything there was translucent. The mountains, the houses, even the sky reflected light in impossible ways. Its inhabitants, she explained, were human-like figures, but their skin shimmered like broken mirrors, fragments of a greater truth. They reflect each other, she explained. No one can hide, because everyone carries pieces of others within themselves. As she spoke, I realized the Valley of Glass wasn't just a setting. It was a perfect metaphor for Elisa's own condition. A body that was once strength had now become fragile, translucent, mirroring pain in every movement. A place where everything was beautiful, but breakable. I asked if anyone ruled this valley, if there was a central figure there. She hesitated and then replied, "Yes. A woman with no face." This woman, Elisa told me, lived isolated at the top of a tower that could never be reached. They said she was the guardian of the waters, controlling the glow that kept the valley alive. But no one knew her name or the origin of her pain. Some called her the one who shattered, others, the guardian of the blades. When I asked what this woman did, Elisa said simply, "She watches. But she never acts." With each new session, Elisa brought a new piece of this world. She drew maps, described rituals, wrote small stories about the valley's inhabitants. Gradually, I realized she was no longer just talking about what she had created, she was rediscovering herself within this universe. And something curious began to happen. The more she explored the Valley of Glass, the more coherent her speech about herself became. It was as if her internal chaos had finally found a language. In one of the most remarkable sessions, she brought a notebook with a worn blue cover and showed me a drawing. In the center of the page, a woman sat on a glass chair. Her feet were dipped in a shallow lake, and around her, waves formed that reflected small scenes, memories, perhaps. In the caption, she had written, "The woman who can no longer run." I asked if that figure was the guardian. Elisa said she didn't know. She said sometimes she thought it was her, other times she believed it was just a part of herself she couldn't bury. Over time, I saw that Elisa was transforming pain into narrative. Every drawing, every text, every imaginary dialogue was an attempt to reorganize what had been shattered. Fantasy wasn't an escape, it was reconstruction. And somehow, I found myself drawn into it too. The boundaries between therapist and spectator began to blur. I caught myself genuinely looking forward to our sessions, eager to see what she would bring next. At one point, I asked what was at the very center of the Valley of Glass, the deepest point of her creation. She thought for a few seconds before answering, slowly, thoughtfully, "A mirror that never reflects the same face twice." The sentence echoed within me. It was as if Elisa had created a perfect metaphor for trauma, a reflection that changes with the angle, that never fully reveals what lies behind. It was then I realized the Valley of Glass wasn't just Elisa's world. It was a mirror for our own desire to understand pain. That imaginary universe spoke of loss, yes, but also of the possibility of rebuilding without denying the scars. And as she spoke, I thought of how many people out there might need to hear a story like this. How many might find solace in realizing that fantasy is not a sign of weakness, but an act of resistance. The first time I noticed something had changed in Elisa was when she walked into the room smiling. A small, almost timid smile, but one I hadn't seen since the treatment began. She seemed different, as if carrying a spark of life that had been dormant before. "I think the Guardian came down from the tower," she said as soon as she sat down. I leaned forward slightly and asked what that meant. Elisa opened the notebook and revealed a new illustration. This time, the faceless woman was standing, walking among the valley's inhabitants. They moved aside as she passed, not out of fear but out of respect. The glass floor reflected her footsteps, and curiously, cracks were forming where she walked. "She came down to feel the ground," Elisa explained. "But the ground can't bear her weight." That image left me silent for a few seconds. The metaphor was clear. The attempt to reconnect with life, with the concrete world, still caused pain. The body, once an instrument of power and movement, was now a weight the glass floor could not support. Elisa was transforming the frustration of her physical limitations into a poetic narrative, and the way she described this transition was profoundly human. As time passed, the Valley of Glass became more and more alive. Elisa spoke of its landscapes with the familiarity of someone describing their own neighborhood. There was the Lake of Voices, where words weren't spoken but echoed in transparent waves. There was also the Bridge of Memories, which could only be crossed by those willing to look at the reflection of their own guilt. And on the horizon, the Wall of Mist, a barrier that hid everything the valley wasn't yet ready to see. She drew these structures with almost architectural precision. And the most impressive thing was to see that each new element emerged in parallel with some advance in her treatment. When she started talking about the Lake of Voices, for example, was also the period when she finally opened up about the night of the accident. The memory came fragmented, between sobs, as if every sentence were a blade. "I don't remember the impact," she said. "I only remember the sound of glass." That sentence stayed with me. It was inevitable to think that the Valley of Glass was born there in the shattering of the windshield, in the instant her body broke along with the world. The name, the reflections, the transparency of everything, were echoes of that night. The trauma had transformed into aesthetics. But the story she was creating wasn't just about destruction. There was also a search for meaning, an attempt to rebuild. And the deeper she delved into the valley, the clearer the figure of the Guardian became. Now, Elisa began to describe her in detail. She said the faceless woman wore a cloak made of mirrored fragments and that, when she moved, each piece reflected a different feeling: anger, longing, fear, hope. "She is made of everything I haven't been able to accept yet," she confessed. By this point, I understood that the valley was more than a defense mechanism. It was a narrative mirror, a form of psychic integration. What Elisa was doing was rewriting her own pain with new rules. And the act of creation itself became a form of healing. It was remarkable. Her speech was more fluid, her gaze steadier. She was beginning to walk emotionally, even if her body still refused to move. Once, I asked her to describe an ordinary day within the valley. I wanted to understand how this world functioned, what its internal laws were. Elisa closed her eyes and began to narrate, in an almost hypnotic voice, evocative, dreamy tone. "In the morning, the sun rises underwater. It passes through the lake and rises slowly, as if the whole world needs to relearn how to breathe. The mirrors on the houses capture this light and project different images, memories, dreams, things people wish to forget. At night, the glow gradually fades, and the valley becomes almost transparent, until it seems like nothing truly exists." There was poetry in the way she spoke. And as time passed, a subtle change was noticeable. Elisa was no longer just an observer of the valley. She began to interact with it. In one session, She told me she had created a new character, a traveler who had appeared from the other side of the wall of mist. This traveler, unlike the other inhabitants, had firm legs but didn't know how to run. She walks slowly, Elisa explained, because she learned the ground can break at any moment. I asked who this traveler represented. Elisa gave a slight smile and replied, "Perhaps you." It was one of the rare moments when I felt my presence in her story was conscious. The Valley of Glass had expanded to such an extent that it now included the space of therapy. I had become a character, part of the symbolic process. And this, in a way, showed she was ready for something more, to integrate the two worlds. The following weeks were intense. Elisa began bringing not just drawings, but also small texts written like the Guardian's diaries. They were fragments of a divided consciousness, almost like letters addressed to herself. In one of them I read, "Today I went down to the valley and saw my reflection for the first time. It was trembling. I thought it was fear, but it was the wind. The glass moves, even when pain tries to keep it still." These writings had a tone of impressive lucidity. There was something deeply philosophical about them, the perception that suffering, when acknowledged, becomes material for transformation. Day after day, I saw the trauma reorganize itself into beauty. But like any healing journey, the process wasn't linear. There were relapses. Moments when Elisa would disappear for weeks, not responding to messages. When she returned, her eyes were heavy, the notebook closed, the silence thicker. "The Guardian broke the mirror," she'd say. "Now no one can see themselves." Those periods were the most difficult. It was as if the world that sustained her also collapsed with her. The fantasy that once served as shelter became a prison. It was necessary to help her rediscover the boundary, to remind her that the valley was a tool, not a replacement. And that required patience. During one of these return sessions, she handed me a loose sheet of paper with a drawing different from the others. There was no glass, no reflections, no shine. Just a dark plane, empty. In the center, a small seed. The caption said, "What grows when the glass dissolves?" It was then I realized Elisa was about to begin a new phase. Something inside her wanted to be born, something real. The Valley of Glass, with all its beauty, had served its purpose, but now it was time to cross the wall of mist. Elisa arrived at the session with a new notebook. The cover was black, simple, without drawings. Unlike the others, it held no colors or reflections, just the discreet mark of a new beginning. "I think I crossed the wall," she said right away, before I could even ask how she was. Her voice was firm, but there was something restrained, a weight that only those who have faced their own abyss can carry with serenity. She opened the notebook, and there were the first sketches of the new territory. The Valley of Glass was left behind. Now, the world Elisa described was opaque, without shine. She called it Pause, the land of pale ashes, a place where everything seemed suspended between what was and what was not yet. "Here, the ground doesn't break," she explained. "But it doesn't reflect anything either." It was clear that Elisa was creating a symbolic transition. The glass, which represented fragility and pain, had been replaced by ashes, the remains of something burned, but which still held warmth. This new phase of her fantasy indicated emotional maturity. It was no longer about mourning what she had lost, but about what could still be born from what remained. As she described the new setting, it was clear the rules had changed. In the land of pale ashes, time didn't run in a straight line. Sometimes a day lasts minutes, sometimes years, she said. Here, time depends on how much silence you can bear. There was something deeply symbolic in that. Silence was precisely what Elisa feared most, and what she was now learning to listen to. The inhabitants of this new world were different from those in the valley. They didn't have mirrored faces or translucent bodies. They were blurred figures, with undefined outlines, as if they were always in the process of becoming. "They dissolve when someone tries to name them," she explained. "I think it's because here, no one is forced to be just one thing." These descriptions revealed a remarkable inner transformation. Elisa was learning to live with impermanence, to accept that you don't need to have all the answers. She was beginning to deal with her own identity not as something fixed, but as a flow. It was the symbolic representation of acceptance. In one of the following sessions, she introduced a new character, the Sculptor of Shadows. A man who shaped figures with his own hands, but who could only work at night. He doesn't create for others to see, she explained. He creates to remember that he is still capable of transforming something, even if no one notices. I asked if she identified with him. Elisa gave a slight smile. I think so. He does what I'm trying to do with myself. Our conversations began to become denser, more philosophical. Elisa no longer spoke only about pain, but about meaning, about the value of what remains even when everything falls apart. At one point, she said a phrase I immediately wrote down, thoughtful, wiseful tone. Fantasy is the place where reality rests when it's too tired. That phrase echoed in me for days. Because, in a way, that's what happens to all of us. We create worlds, stories, images not to escape, but to give a break to what weighs too heavily. Elisa was becoming a kind of narrator of her own reconstruction. And I, as her therapist, found myself increasingly a witness and a student of this process. But something new was simmering beneath the surface. A subtle tension, a restlessness I couldn't yet name. Elisa began reporting vivid dreams, almost visions. She said she sometimes woke up feeling she had actually been in the land of pale ashes. She could smell the dust, feel the cold wind, hear the distant sound of footsteps. It's as if the world I invented has started to invent me back, she confessed. That sentence put me on alert. It was common for intense therapeutic processes to produce deep immersions in the imaginary, but there was a delicate boundary between the symbolic use of fantasy and total fusion with it. I asked if she was afraid of that. Elisa replied, "No. I'm afraid of coming back and discovering that nothing makes sense out here anymore." Those words revealed how much fantasy had become her space of belonging. Care was needed. The art that heals can also consume, if we forget that the body is the anchor point of the soul. So, I decided to propose something new. I asked her to bring an element from the land of pale ashes into the real world. Something physical, tangible. At the next session, Elisa brought a small sculpture made of clay. It was imperfect, misshapen, but there was something profoundly human about it. She said it represented the sculptor of shadows. He doesn't need to be beautiful, she explained. He just needs to exist. That moved me. For the first time, she was materializing outside herself something that previously only lived in her mind. From then on, the process gained another layer. Elisa began transforming her creations into concrete works, paintings, models, short texts. And the most surprising thing was to see how art became a bridge between the two worlds. She was no longer trapped in fantasy, she was learning to dialogue with it. It was as if the Valley of Glass and the Land of Pale Ashes were now symbolic territories of the same internal map. But, like any crossing, this one also demanded a price. As she advanced, Elisa began to notice that some parts of the Valley of Glass were disappearing. "When I go back there, the mountains are broken, the mirrors don't reflect anymore," she told me once. "It's as if the world is dying." I explained that perhaps the valley had fulfilled its role and that when something heals, it no longer needs to exist in the same way. Elisa was silent for a time, then said, "But it's sad to leave behind what saved you." That sentence stayed with me, because it's not easy to let go of your own shelter, even when we no longer need it. Fantasy had been the ground beneath her feet when the real world fell apart, and now she had to learn to walk without it. In the weeks that followed, Elisa began writing a text she called Letters to the Guardian. They were messages addressed to that faceless woman who once commanded the Valley of Glass. I read deeply symbolic passages, like this one. "You taught me to bear the reflection. Now I learn to bear the void. I know one day I will see you again, and when that happens, I hope you have a face my own." Those words represented a turning point. Elisa wasn't just accepting the pain, she was recognizing it as part of her own identity. The Guardian, the faceless woman, was the personification of what she had lost and was now being reintegrated. However, one last challenge still awaited her. One afternoon, Elisa arrived looking downcast, her hands trembling. "I dreamed about the accident again," she said. "But this time it was different. I wasn't in the car. I was by the roadside, watching it all happen. And when the glass broke, I saw someone coming out of it, the Guardian." I remained silent, letting her continue. Elisa took a deep breath and finished. She looked at me and said, Now it's up to you." There was something definitive in that phrase, as if her unconscious had finally handed control back to her consciousness. The fantasy had fulfilled its therapeutic function, to make space for reality to be bearable again. And, in a way, that dream marked the beginning of the end of the process. But the ending, as you will see, wasn't what I expected. Because sometimes, when a person decides to live again, the world they created doesn't disappear, it transforms. And it's precisely in that transformation that the true miracle of the human mind resides. If this story has held your attention, if you want to understand what happens when fantasy becomes part of the healing, not just a refuge, but a path back to life, then I invite you to stay with me. What comes next is the most delicate and revealing part of this journey. There are moments when therapy ceases to be just dialogue. It becomes something silent, almost sacred, as if the room transforms into a space suspended between the real and the invisible. That's exactly how it was in Elisa's final weeks. She didn't speak much, but there was a density in the air, a kind of waiting. I felt something was approaching, something that had been in the works since the first drawing, since the instant the glass shattered. Elisa began bringing few papers, almost no art. She said she was saving the shine. I didn't immediately understand what she meant, but I let the silence do the work that words sometimes cannot. Until one day, without warning, she walked in with a black notebook in her hands and announced, "The Guardian has returned." She opened the notebook and showed me a series of drawings. The faceless woman was standing in the middle of the land of pale ashes. The mirrored cloak was gone. In its place, a simple dress made of dark fabric, with almost no details. The surrounding scene seemed to be transforming. The ashes were turning into fertile soil, and plant sprouts emerged from the cracks. Elisa explained, "She took off the mirrors because she no longer needs to hide behind the reflection of others." It was a powerful symbol. The Guardian, once distant and unattainable, now walked on solid ground, alive, human. The metaphor was clear. Elisa was becoming the author of her own story. And what impressed me was that, even without realizing it, she was describing a psychological process of integration, something that takes years for many patients. During that session, Elisa talked about something new. She said the Guardian had found a home, a small cabin built on the shores of the dry lake that was once the center of the Valley of Glass. She lights a lamp every night and watches the reflection that remains. Not to remember what she lost, but to be grateful for what she learned. The simplicity of that image touched me deeply. Because there was a rare recognition there, that pain, when accepted, becomes wisdom. And, in a way, I felt the cycle was closing. It was then that Elisa began to speak about the future. She said she wanted to exhibit her drawings, tell her story publicly. "But not as something sad," she explained. "I want to show that the world that saved me can save other people too." In that moment, I understood she had transformed fantasy into a mission. What began as refuge was now becoming a bridge away to connect with the world. It was moving to see this metamorphosis. Yet, something told me one last piece was still missing. And it came unexpectedly. One Thursday morning, Elisa arrived earlier than usual. She was serious, almost solemn. She sat down and stayed silent for a while, looking at her own hands. Then she opened the notebook and said, "I finally saw her face." My heart quickened. This was the revelation that, in a way, had been building from the start. I asked what she had seen, and she replied calmly, "It was mine. But older, with marks I don't have yet." And she was smiling. We sat in silence for long minutes. Elisa seemed at peace, and I understood what that dream or vision represented. The Guardian, who had always been a symbol of pain and loss, now revealed herself as the reflection of a future version of Elisa, one who had learned to live with the scars. It was the archetype of a woman reconciled with herself. "She told me something," Elisa continued. "She said, 'Now you can go. The valley doesn't need me anymore.'" Those words sealed the end of the symbolic cycle. The Guardian, who once watched from afar, had finally become a part of her. The unconscious had completed its journey. But, like any conclusion, this one also brought its risks. After that session, Elisa didn't come for a week. And when she returned, something was different. She looked exhausted, but not defeated, like someone who has crossed an internal desert and survived. She brought with her one last painting, which would put a final period on everything she had created until then. The painting showed the land of pale ashes seen from above. In the center, the Guardian's cabin. And around it, what was once desolation now bloomed in soft shades of green and blue. In the lower corner, Elisa had written a phrase. "The glass broke, but the light still passes through." When I read that, I felt a mix of admiration and humility, because, in essence, the entire therapeutic process was summed up in that image. The glass symbol of pain, fragility, trauma didn't need to be restored. It was enough to accept its cracks and allow the light to keep passing through. In the sessions that followed, Elisa began planning her new life. She talked about lectures, books, exhibitions. She said she wanted to use the name Valley of Glass as the title of an artistic project aimed at the emotional rehabilitation of people with physical limitations. "I want them to know that imagination isn't an escape," she said. "It's construction." I saw in her a serene strength, a conviction that is only born when someone touches the bottom of their own pain and returns with something in their hands. And as I listened, I realized this story wasn't just hers. It was also about all of us, about the power to create meaning when the world seems to have taken it all away. But there's one last conversation I will never forget. It was in one of our final sessions. Elisa came in, sat before me, and asked, "Do you believe the valley still exists?" I replied cautiously, "I think so. Perhaps not as before. Perhaps it exists every time you revisit it, or every time someone recognizes themselves in your story." She smiled. "Then it will never end." That answer moved me more than I expected, because, in a way, she was right. The worlds we create, whether they're made of glass, ashes, or words, never completely disappear. They remain alive in the people we touch, in gestures, in memories, in the small daily acts of courage. And, realizing this, I felt my role there had ended. Elisa no longer needed me as a mediator between pain and meaning. She had learned to move between the two worlds with wisdom. Before ending our sessions, I asked her what she had learned most from all of this. She thought for a moment and replied, "I learned that fantasy didn't take me away from reality. It taught me to see it with different eyes." I left that last session with a feeling that I had witnessed something rare, the healing born from imagination, the human power to rebuild the invisible in order to continue existing in the visible. But, like any good story, Elisa's held one last symbolic gesture. Weeks later, I received an invitation. It was for the opening of an exhibition titled, "When Creating Fantasies Became a Particular Therapy." The title was the same one you now know, and upon entering the gallery, I realized that everything, absolutely everything, was there. The illustrations of the Valley of Glass, the sculptures of the Land of Pale Ashes, the Guardian's diaries. But in the center, illuminated by a soft light, there was a new, unprecedented work. A mirror. On the frame, Elisa had engraved the words, "For those who still believe that creating is an act of escape, look and see. Perhaps it is an act of return." People approached, looked into the mirror, and saw their own faces reflected. It was impossible not to be moved. Because, in that instant, everyone became a little part of that world she had created. And I realized that Elisa's fantasy was complete not when she healed the pain, but when she shared its light. But what happened next is something that deserves to be told calmly. Because the last part of this story isn't about the valley, or the Guardian, or the accident. It's about what remained and about the silent power that is born when pain transforms into purpose. And that is exactly what you will discover in the final part of this story. If you've made it this far, stay with me. The ending is not a farewell, it's a new beginning. And perhaps, upon hearing the end, you too will begin to see the fragments of your own story with a little more light. Every healing story has two endings, the one that actually happens, and the one that remains within those who lived it. Elisa's was like that, double, delicate, impossible to separate. And perhaps that's why, as I narrate now everything I experienced beside her, I don't speak only as a psychologist, but as someone who was transformed along the way. After the exhibition, Elisa's life gained momentum. She started traveling, giving lectures, creating workshops on therapeutic imagination, and what surprised me most was the naturalness with which she spoke of her own pain without needing to dramatize it. It was as if she had found a language of healing, and more than that, a way to offer that language to others. One day, months after the exhibition, I received a message from her. Simple, I managed to run. It took me a moment to comprehend. When we met again, Elisa explained. She had undergone intensive physiotherapy and, with the help of orthotics and immense effort, had managed to take a few quick steps, still short, but full of meaning. "It's not like before," she said, "but it's enough to feel the wind." And in that moment, I understood it wasn't about speed, but reconciliation. Her body, which had been a landscape of frustration and pain, was now a territory of reunion. Every step she took was like a distant echo from the Valley of Glass, the sound of something that breaks, but doesn't die. With time, Elisa published a book. Not a manual on overcoming, but a poetic account of her journey. It blended fiction and memory, reality and imagination, so the reader never knew exactly what was true and what was symbolic. She said that was the intention. "I want each person to find their own Valley of Glass within the story." The book became an unexpected success. But what moved me most wasn't the recognition, but the letters she began to receive. People from all over the country wrote telling her how they had identified with her trajectory: grieving mothers, blocked artists, trauma survivors, people who had lost part of their mobility, but not the desire to create. Many said the same phrase, "You reminded me that imagination walks too." And it was at that point I understood the real dimension of what she had built. The world born from one woman's pain was now healing other people. What was just therapeutic fiction had become a shared territory of new beginnings. But I want to tell you something I never forgot. In one of our last conversations, Elisa said, I discovered that the Valley of Glass still exists, but now inside the people who have read about it. Each of them carries a little piece of it. And when someone creates, even without realizing it, the valley shines a little again. Those words stayed with me as a silent reminder of the true power of imagination. Because, in the end, perhaps we are all made of small fragments of glass broken at different times, but capable of reflecting light when placed at the right angle. And that makes me think of you, listening to this story now. Perhaps, on some level, you too have your own Valley of Glass. Perhaps there is a part of your life that broke a dream, a relationship, a piece of who you were, and it still hurts when you try to look at it directly. But what I learned from Elisa is that we don't need to fix everything. Sometimes, all we need is to change how we look at the shards. The fantasy she created wasn't an escape from pain, it was a way to dialogue with it. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take from this story, it's this: the power to imagine is the power to survive. There is no healing without narrative. There is no new beginning without the act of recreating your own story. And if, for some reason, you doubt this, think about what Elisa did. She transformed the sound of shattering glass into an entire valley, full of life, full of meaning. She took what was left of the accident and made it a path. With time, I learned that this is the true meaning of psychotherapy: not to erase pain, but to transform it into language. And that's what Elisa taught me, without ever needing to say it directly. A few months ago, she sent me a photograph. It showed a group of people in wheelchairs, laughing as they painted panels of colored glass. In the caption, she wrote, "The valley is collective now." And I, seeing that, realized her creation hadn't just healed her, it had multiplied healing. What began as a private fantasy had become a legacy of imagination and empathy. Today, when I speak of Elisa, I don't speak of her as a patient. I speak of her as someone who showed me what it truly means to create. To create when all seems lost. To create when the body fails. To create when the world says there's no way out. To create like one breathes. And if you've made it this far, perhaps you feel the same call. Perhaps this story has awakened in you an old desire to take your own fragments and start something new. And if that's the case, I ask you, don't let that desire fade. Because what keeps the Valley of Glass alive isn't Elisa, nor me. It's every person who decides to transform pain into art, fear into words, silence into creation. And if this story touched you, if you felt at any moment that it spoke to something inside you, I want to invite you to be part of this cycle. Share this story. Comment on what it awakened in you. Tell us what your own valley is, because it might be that someone, on the other side of the screen, needs to hear just that. After all, stories like Elisa's don't end, they continue, multiplied in every voice that carries them. And perhaps, the moment you tell yours, the glass around you will also start to let the light through.